I personally could have used a few more seconds to get myself together, but
Yeah, the film's not as funny as I remember it being.
Rudy, I'm so happy to be here with you, and I think this is the perfect capstone to this particular event because I think what we're trying to do here is not just talk about the numbers, which I think a lot of people have gotten caught up with when it comes to incarceration because, in fact, the numbers are so staggering that sometimes there's really not a will to go beyond them. You know, you say the number 1 and 2, that itself is a mic drop, but you say 1 and 2, and then you ask people to raise their hands, and it is a completely different experience. And I think the reason your film is so affecting for so many people, myself included, is because the experience of having a loved one who is incarcerated for such a long time was so lonely, which is nuts when you think about how many people are actually affected by it. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about the point where the films that you were taking, the videos you were taking, went from being something just for Cindy to something much bigger than that.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. This is amazing. It's always amazing to come into a room and see people, involved in this and wanting to fight this fight. When you read about my film, you see on paper that I made it over the course of a decade. And I always start there because, on paper I did make it over the course of the decade. I started filming the day after my sister went away. But I always go back to the day before, February 29th, 2008, because it was there that I realized that, while this film took me a decade, it was something that was burning in me for a very long time. I grew up feeling very underrepresented, like I didn't have a voice, like my community was overlooked, my family was overlooked. And I remember sitting in that courtroom that day and them saying that she's going away for 15 years and these federal marshals come down the aisle and they take her away. And I'm looking around and I have that feeling that I'd had so long in my life, is thinking, who's going to say something? Who's going to help? And I'm looking around and I realized right then that nobody's coming. Nobody's going to help. And I didn't know what it meant at that point, but I knew that I had to fight. And I didn't know what that was going to be, but the next day I went to my sister's house and her daughters were there. Just, her daughters were, 4, 2, and 6 weeks old at the time. And I didn't know what to do, and I knew that I was going to fight and I was going to do everything I could to try and get her out, but in the meantime, she wasn't going to see them grow up. And there happened to be a little handy cam that Cindy always had around, and I picked it up and I just started filming the girls because I thought, at the very least, I can try and allow her to watch them grow up. I knew that she would have phone calls and letters, but I wanted her to see them live. And so I started doing that, and I was living in New York City at the time, and I would fly back whenever I could, and for birthdays or special events and things like that. And the moment that this turned into a documentary was actually the scene that you just watched. It's the opening scene in the film for a reason. I distinctly remember, again, living in New York City, having about $540 in my bank account, and the round trip ticket back to Michigan was $380, but it was Autumn's first dance recital, her oldest daughter. And I said, I have to be there. I have to go and film this. Cindy's gonna wanna see this, and she's gonna wanna see it filmed by a family member. She's gonna wanna see her getting ready. So I'm just there filming Autumn getting ready, and Cindy calls completely organically. And she says that line, do you know what mommy's gonna do while you go to dance? I'm gonna lay down in my bed, I'm gonna close my eyes, and I'm gonna think about you. In that moment, it changed everything, because I realized that I had an opportunity to tell a story that you don't normally get to see. The ramifications of these long sentences, the people left behind, and I was going to be able to tell the story from the inside out. And that I quit everything. I was a teacher, I was an actor, I was a writer, I was doing a lot of other things, and I quit everything. And I said in that moment, I was like, I'm gonna tell this story, I'm gonna make this film, and I had no idea what that meant. But I went back to New York, and I started, making calls and trying to introduce myself to people, and I started PAing and working on everybody else's film so that I could figure out how to do this, how to make this story, and I dedicated my life to documentary film, and this film was my film school, and that's how it all sort of started.
Yeah. Can we go back to one of those first scenes? I noticed that when your nieces are talking to you, they say, "Are you sad that she's somewhere far away?"
Yeah.
Is that what you guys told them about where she was, or did they just not really understand?
No, that's one of the things I'll always credit Cindy for. She never lied about where she was or what was going on. She's asking if I'm sad that she's far away because it was literally an 8-hour drive to see her when they were going to see her. And so she knew the reason she could only see her at that point every 6 weeks or 8 weeks was because it was an 8-hour drive and it was expensive, and so she was hurting. Like, that question is really why she's sad. She's sad because mommy's far away and she can't go and see her and she can't hug her whenever she wants. That's where that question stemmed from. So yeah, no, they were always, especially Autumn, the oldest, was always very informed about what was happening.
Did their understanding or reaction to the fact that their mom was incarcerated change over time? As you said, she was gone for 9 years. They were obviously very small when she left and then had to grow up kind of in the shadow of that. How did their feelings or thoughts about the situation change as they grew?
It's interesting because Autumn, we've talked about this since the films come out and all these things. Autumn certainly changed throughout the process. For the younger two girls, Anna was 6 weeks old, so she didn't know anything else. Her mother was a phone, and this person that she would go and visit, every few weeks, or at one time when she was moved to Florida, once a year. So she was this disconnected, person. Ava, was too young to really remember mommy being home, and I remember Autumn asking her about how she felt about a lot of this. And she said to me, because she changed, and you see it if you watch the film. Please watch the film. If you watch the film, she's this young, like, precocious, articulate, very bubbly, outspoken kid. And then as she grows older, you see this sort of the weight of the world bearing down on her. And at the end, we talk about statistics in films and things like that. And I decided when we started to edit this film that I was not going to have a single stat card in this film. There's not one stat in this entire film. And my producers and editors at the beginning were like, let's pause before we make that statement. And I said, no, I will not have a single stat card in this film. And they said, why? And I said, well, let me show you. And so we went through the editing process, and I refused to put a single stat card, and they're watching one of the first cuts, and there's a scene at the end where Cindy's oldest daughter, Autumn, looks up at the camera, and she says, "Hi, I'm Autumn, and I'm 13 years old." And you see what this time has done to her. You see on her face what time away from her mother has done to her and the weight of the world on her shoulders. And I said, that's why we don't need a stat card, because we have a human face that we can put on this. And that's going to carry on longer than any stat when somebody leaves this film. So, when you ask about how they were, it's a tough question to answer because we still don't know. Yeah. They were affected throughout this process, but, they had their mother away for 9.5 years. And it's long lasting. These effects are going to affect them for a very long time. So it's been a long process for them. And it's tough to even say how they've changed because it's been such the norm for them for so long.
I want to let our audience know that we will be coming to you for questions. I just have a few more questions for Rudy. So if you do have questions, get those hands up. We have mic runners in the aisles.
No math question.
So by some accounts, Cindy was actually pretty lucky. She was one of, I believe, 1,600 people who had their sentences cut short out of something like 36,000 who were eligible. I'm wondering what you think contributed to that, and then also what Cindy's feeling was coming out and realizing that she was one of very few.
Yeah. So you're asking what attributed to her being?
Yeah.
That's a very difficult question to answer because I do not know. Yeah. Many of you who've gone through this process who are in this process know it is not a transparent thing. People, I can't tell you how many emails that I've received saying, "How did you do it?" and I keep telling people, I don't know how I did it. The only thing that I know that I actively did, or that we did it as a family, was I played the long game. As you can see, it took me 10 years to make this film. I play the long game in a lot of things, and I looked at when I realized finally that it wasn't a clerical error, that she was going to be in prison for 15 years. I looked at what that 15 years looked like, what the process was, and all the milestones that we had to hit for her possibly getting some sort of relief. And I saw these first couple appeals and this third appeal, and then way down the road, 9.5 years down the road, I saw clemency. Like, that's something that, if none of this works, that's a possibility. And I said, well, I'm going to get started on that now. And so I was living in New York, and anytime there was a hearing or a rally, and I worked with FAM a lot throughout this process, anytime there was anything going on, I would drive to DC, most of the time not invited, and just walk into these places, and I would talk to every single person who would talk to me. And I would say Cindy's full name. I would tell her story. I would never say her or she. I would say Cynthia Shank, Cynthia Shank, Cynthia Shank. And I took page 1 of the political handbook, and I said, name recognition. I want people to recognize her name, because at some point, if I talk to enough people and they hear her story, 8 years down the road, 9 years down the road, I'm going to write this petition. And my hope is whoever's desk that's going across is going to look at that name and say, Cynthia Shank, I know that name, and open up that folder, because I knew if I could get them to open up that folder and read that she had a chance. And it's bittersweet, because throughout that decade of doing this, I met so many families, so many people who, if people opened up that folder and read their story and read why they were there, that they would have a chance. And unfortunately, I think so many people's stories and so many people's petitions just aren't read. You know, it's such there's so many to go through, and I don't know what put my sisters through. I'll probably never know, but it's certainly something that's bittersweet. And and if you watch the film, I hope you watch the film. If you watch the film, we talked to Cindy about that, and because she was fresh home, she didn't know the odds. She knew the odds, but she didn't know how many people had come home and how many people were not going to come home. And I sort of broke the news to her, and she has this 2-second moment of sort of relief, and I talked to her about this later, because she has this complete turn, because it hits her, all of the people that are still there, that are left behind, that are just as deserving as her, if not more, to be home with their families.
I have one more question for you before we go to the audience. As we've heard before, and I think as we know, release is the first step, and often after that, there is not a lot of help for kind of reintegrating into your life. What is Cindy's life like now?
Again, like we had mentioned earlier, Cindy is sort of a best case scenario in a lot of ways. She had a family that is helping her emotionally, financially, in every way possible, and it still was completely. I don't know how people don't go back when they come home. I have no idea how a person without resources doesn't head directly back into prison, because even with all of these the benefits that she had of a family supporting her and a place to go and not having to worry about paying a bill right when she gets home, it was difficult. She was asked to go and report to a place 3 hours away, and they were like, if you don't report, then it's then you're gonna have to go back to the halfway house, and you're gonna have to do all these things. And if she didn't have a car, it was a 3-hour drive, it would have been a 6-hour bus ride. And if you don't have she left prison with $45, and they clipped her license in half when she left. I don't know because she did a program and earned her CDL there. She was like, well, maybe I can do something with this. And they literally, as she was leaving, one of the first things she showed me when she got in the car was, they clipped my license in half. And I was like, well, why'd they do that? She said, they said it was expired. And it doesn't expire for 5 years, but they clip it. And she's like, I have a check. She was like, how do I cash this check? And luckily we were there to pick her up. I don't know what people do. And somebody had talked earlier about shame. One of the things that she was forced to do when she came home, because she was on home confinement for 2 months, anywhere she went, she had to go in and talk to the manager of the place or the highest ranking person at the place and say, hi, I'm a felon on home confinement. I need you to sign this to prove that I was here because I have to turn in this timesheet. And, I remember her wanting to go have breakfast with my father at this place that he loves to go to. And he was so excited. And his friend owns the place, and they sat down, and she had to go to his friend and say, hi, could you please sign this? I'm a felon. I just got home from prison. And she wasn't ashamed. And my father, that everyone knew what was going on, but still, like that constant reminder that you are other, you are less than, and you have to have to continue to prove yourself to us. And I always talk about shame because I feel like incarcerated individuals and families of incarcerated individuals and communities with high populations of incarcerated individuals have this shame or stigma about them. And I feel like that has to shift. And some of this shame and stigma has to go on the system that is perpetuating this. They should share some of this shame. So it's difficult coming home.
Yeah. Do we have any audience questions? I think we have one back there.
Hi, my name is Emma Coleman. I work with the nonprofit Hope House, and I facilitate a parenting class in FCI Cumberland with dads whose children live in DC. And one of the things that the dads struggle with the most is answering the question, especially from their younger children, of when are you coming home? And I was wondering if in any of the observations that you had with Cindy and her kids, how she answered those questions that she might not have a definitive answer for.
I think that again, it's difficult, and it was difficult at the time, but she was always 100% honest about when she was coming home. Because she would talk to other women in there who would tell their kids, mommy's at college, or mommy's in the army, or mommy's working, and she'll be home in 2 years, and then 2 years passes, and she has to figure out another way to explain why mommy's not home yet. And she said, I never wanted to continue this pain, and I never wanted to make it this slow Band-Aid. That she was always completely honest about the fact that mommy, the way she would explain to them when she was coming home would be life milestones. So Autumn always understood that if mommy does all of her time, she really hopes she'll be home for prom, for her senior prom.
And I think we have one more question right here.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. My name is Olivia. It's very loud. I work on the Senate Small Business Committee. And one of the things that I think about a lot is what can people like me, where we work on policy issues that aren't necessarily always the first thing you think about when you think about criminal justice or social justice, what can we do to help lessen the burden on families like yours going through this reentry process?
The reentry process, it's interesting because it's actually one of the things that Cindy's trying to do, and it's empowering people who have gone through the process, I think, to help others who are now going through the process, because, I think emotionally she's now reaching out to people or trying to work with people who are coming home, just because she knows how she was feeling, and there were maybe resources that she could have gone to or she didn't know about. I think preparing somebody for all of the things that are available to them, I think, is the most important, because she didn't really know. And again, she was very lucky because she maybe didn't need these resources as much as other people. But I think that there are a lot of people coming home, and it's, I equate it to a lot of things, like somebody coming home from a war, or somebody, you're back in a population that does not understand what you've just gone through. And you're inundated with all of these options and things and paths, and sometimes it takes somebody else who has gone to war to say, listen, I know what you're going through. This is how we can help you transition. It's in a weird way, the simplest thing to think about, but it's also a difficult thing, obviously, to implement. But, we have to lean on each other in a lot of ways, and lean on people with like-minded or with similar circumstances.
Yeah. I want to thank Rudy so much for joining us, for sharing your family story. The film is available on HBO still. If you would like to see it, please join me in thanking him.